Now I would like to continue with our third session, where I'm going to invite Thomas Mueller, CEO of Canada GBC, to take us through this session of thinking how we can build resilience for economies, thinking about policies, cities, and infrastructure. So thank you everyone for joining us. And please, Thomas, if you can share your screen, we're happy to have you and introduce you all of the members of the panel.
Yeah, Juanita, good morning, everyone. I think somebody needs to start my video because it's been blocked by the organizers. So if you can start the video, then we'll be on our way.
You should be able to turn on your video now. There you go. Thank you.
There we go. Thank you. I'm really looking forward to the session this morning on resiliency. And of course, we wanted to bring in a little bit of a different perspective as the last session of today around infrastructure, resiliency, and kind of a bit of a more economic context. And we have today two great speakers and panelists. One is Clay Nessler. He is the global lead for buildings for the World Resources Institute, the Ross Center for Sustainable Cities. In this role, he provides building leadership to urban efficiency and climate. In 2014, Clay helped establish the World Resources Institute Buildings Initiative and served as the industry co-convener of the Sustainable Energy for All Buildings Efficiency Accelerator. Clay joined the World Resources Institute after 39 years in Johnson Controls, where he held a variety of global leadership positions. So welcome, Clay. The other one of our panelists is Ilan Kupperstein. He is a C40 Regional Deputy Director for Latin America, and he's responsible for supporting C40 projects and programs in the 12 member cities in the region. Before that, Ilan has worked as C40 as a city advisor for Rio de Janeiro, where he supported the implementation of the climate action plan in different areas. And then after this, Ilan has successfully launched the C40 Clean Energy Network, which currently has more than 30 cities in various regions of C40. So welcome to both of you. I don't see Clay yet. Is he on camera? Hello, Ian. How are you?
Yes, we can see Clay.
We can see Clay now too. Great. So I wanted to just give maybe a little bit of an overview, of the session, in that I think we all understand that investments in infrastructure are long-term and require really thoughtful consideration on how they can provide the biggest benefits for the communities they are supposed to serve. In a context of climate change, and this is obviously a core theme that's being discussed today, and consideration was also given to obviously what infrastructure will look like to reduce carbon emissions, such as through, let's say, renewable energy systems, but also that infrastructure is being invested in to create resilient infrastructure systems that are both flexible and adapted to deal with climate change. Buildings are an important part of infrastructure, and the interplay between buildings and infrastructure, in my opinion, will play a very critical role in addressing climate change, human health, and then also infrastructure as such, and the investment in infrastructure, economic prosperity. So with our two panelists, with that introduction, I wanted to kick it off. And I wanted to ask you that when, traditionally buildings were not considered to be part of infrastructure. This obviously needs to change, it's changing here in Canada. What are you seeing in cities in the Americas with regards to a broader view of infrastructure and investment decision in this infrastructure and buildings kind of context? Who wants to go first? Clay, you want to go first?
Sure, absolutely. So first, thanks to the World Green Building Council in the Americas region for inviting me to speak. I've been involved in the Americas region since it was created a number of years ago, and I found great value through its work, both from the industry side and now wearing a environmental, non-governmental organization side as well. So thank you very much for your partnership there. And thank you, Thomas, for chairing this discussion. From a building side, we have seen a shift, a significant shift for just in the term infrastructure. If you go back 10, 20 years, infrastructure was merely bridges, roads, and civil engineering projects that supported transportation and kept water out of our streets, it seems. And lately, I think because of the importance of climate change and because of the critical role energy has in both our health, our safety, and our security due to climate change, the energy transition is now front and center in any work in infrastructure. And speaking from the United States perspective, yes, there will be money invested in bridges, there will be money invested in roads, but increasingly we see investment in mass transportation. We see investment in EV charging infrastructure for an increasing fleet of EV vehicles, both personal vehicles as well as light duty, and increasingly heavy duty trucks, which are on the horizon. We also see digital technology increasingly included in the discussion of infrastructure because we need more sensing, we need more control, and we need more flexibility in our infrastructure to not only manage it more efficiently, but actually to be able to respond to more emergency situations. There are a number of trends in the energy systems around the Americas, both North, Central, and South America. And in the old days of central power plants, squirting electrons through wires, going to buildings which consume them, those days are rapidly coming to an end where buildings and other energy consuming infrastructure will be prosumers. They will not only consume electricity, they will produce electricity. They will store electricity. They will control electricity in flexible ways to be able to help support the grid. So I think two key trends that bode very well for the WGBC's interest in zero carbon buildings that are resilient and healthy is this trend towards the integration of the built environment with other infrastructure, whether that be water, whether that be power, whether that be transportation. So all moving in the right direction.
Thank you, Clay. Ilan, do you see the same trends in your work with the cities in the Americas?
Hi, Thomas. Hi, Clay. Good to see you after almost 2 years. Seems like another era. Thank you for the invitation to the World Green Building Council.
Welcome.
And yes, I have to say that, thank you. I completely agree with what Clay was saying. And in fact, I was reading a bit about the politics behind the term infrastructure. And it's quite interesting because it was picked up as a French word by President Eisenhower in the aftermath of World War II to describe a wide array of military investments that they wanted, the US government was planning to make and also to enhance in other parts of the world. So not the origin, the original term is in French, but how we came to understand it came from a military background. And it basically meant all of the capital expenses that are not, there are different arguments, even economic, but let's say it was the base and not the plane. So how to finance a military base would be infrastructure, whereas the plane and the missile sort of investment. And from then on, it came to the civilian sector, meaning a lot of what Clay was saying. So bridges, water, big water management systems, and large investments. But recently, we've seen this term also getting another meaning with, I guess, there's a word in international relations theory, which is securitizing. So climate change now is seen as a threat to our existence on Earth. So, and it is, not to the Earth itself, to human existence on Earth. So it makes sense for us to look at infrastructure as this critical component of investments, of the components that make our lives possible on Earth. They need investment to cope with the impacts that we already feel and the impacts that are to be felt due to climate change. And more interestingly, I would say, is that urban infrastructure has been a term used since the 70s and 80s to describe the same kind of transportation and water structure, but specifically for cities. But recently, a key thing that we should highlight is the term green infrastructure. It's the first time that we see this type of nomenclature being used for nature. So natural capital, green infrastructure, these are all terms that have been used more recently. That's from the 2000s till now. Green infrastructure, even more recent, that show the centrality that nature has been taking in the way we see the solutions to a crisis, rather than something that's outside of a general economic and planning thinking. It's become a central part of planning. So if you say green infrastructure, this creates a kind of a trigger that it's easier somehow to incorporate it in, calculations or cost benefit analysis for general or more orthodox planning, which is a good sign, but we still have a long way ahead.
You know what, that's an interesting, thank you for mentioning that, Ilan, because I think that's also, we're seeing that in North America too, that kind of the definition of infrastructure, one is expanding to include buildings and the interaction between buildings and the infrastructure systems. And we understand now that pretty much everything we do on the infrastructure side, being pumping water or pumping sewage or generating waste, generates carbon emissions, right? And has an environmental impact. So I think that's really important to keep in mind, that it's not just the energy that we're using to heat or cool or power buildings, but it's also the everything else. Like if the water, you have to pump water, and you usually use natural gas to do that. So that's really important. But then the other part, the other definition that you just added to is these natural systems that we have kind of disregarded, but which provide a very important service to us in terms of creating resilient infrastructure, is it flood control, if it's soil or forestry or agriculture for carbon sequestration. I think that's a really important consideration to keep in mind for those on the call, that it's not just the hard infrastructure investing in, it's also kind of the soft infrastructure investing within the natural systems. And we do see now, anyway, I would just like to hear both of your opinions on it before we get more into the energy and carbon side. But we do see now investment flowing into natural systems to offset carbon by large corporations. Do you see that both? Do you see that in the Americas as well? Maybe Ilan or Claire, you can take turns. I don't want to just speak freely.
Definitely.
Go ahead, Clay.
Yeah, definitely do see investment in green infrastructure, and it takes a variety of forms, and a term I really like, I did scratch my head the first time I heard it when I was in China, was sponge cities. And sponge cities, if you actually guess what it means, that's exactly what it means. It means using nature to soak up excess water. And there's a number of benefits of that. Just, slowing down the advance of surges actually storing the water for when you need it. That is a huge, actually, in California right now, where we're seeing tremendous drought. Yes, it's one thing to reduce a short-term flooding issue. It's another thing to replenish reservoirs. Of course, water that is soaked up in nature doesn't have to be pumped to a water treatment plant, treated, and then pumped back, right? It can be done locally. I think a key point is that we shouldn't view these things as two different things. Green infrastructure has a significant role in advancing net zero carbon buildings. Think of all the opportunities, from green roofs, which capture water, to green walls, which shade the building. Green infrastructure near a building provides shade. All of this contributes to the passive efficiency of buildings, which are absolutely critical. Plus, we know what happens painfully when the power goes out. Those passive efficiency issues or measures are the things that keeps buildings cool in very, very hot weather. In fact, reflective roofs, whether white or whether green or other ways of reducing heat island effect, really impact health and safety. Multiple degrees of cooling can be implemented just through green infrastructure within buildings. By the way, that also reduces the energy need and the need to use electricity, often carbon-based, to cool those buildings. There's this sort of weird irony that the more air conditioning we use, the warmer it gets. And we need to make sure that the power used in these air conditioning systems is clean, hopefully local, hopefully on site or on building, but at least clean, so that the heat island effects, which are severely dangerous. Just look what happened in the Pacific Northwest of the United States, in Oregon and Washington. It doesn't get to be 110 degrees in Canada or in the Pacific Northwest, but it did. These folks don't have air conditioning. It created very serious conditions there. So green infrastructure is every bit as important to mitigation as it is to resiliency, and it's a critical element of building strategies at a city level.
Yeah, Elon, you want to come into that one as well? Because I do see, I think it's a very good point, Clay, that one is the green roofs, green walls, habitat restoration you often find with green buildings, or more sensitive land development, maintaining streams, maintaining habitat, and those types of things. But it's also, in a way, kind of it's almost like Canada, as you pointed out. We at one of the, where I live on the West Coast, we had the hottest summer ever on record. We had like 47 degrees Celsius in British Columbia. Like, it was the cherries on the trees were actually cooking on the tree. It was that hot, believe it or not. I'm not making this up. This is actually true. And so in that context, right, this green infrastructure in cities, like places like natural areas where people can actually, they cool down the city, and more regenerate cities to be more green areas than just, you know, concrete and asphalt, I think is a really important concept that's emerging now to keep cities in this age of climate change more resilient and actually livable. So Elon, I'm sure you have some perspective on that.
Yeah, this is a fascinating subject, and Latin American cities have already been feeling the impacts of climate change for quite a while, for a variety of reasons. But every big city in Brazil, for instance, or even other main big cities like Buenos Aires, or the Colombian cities, Bogota, Medellin, Mexico, they've all been feeling the impacts of flooding, of urban heat islands, and sometimes even drought, which affects cities deeply. Brazil is, for instance, now in a historical drought, the worst drought in 100 years. And this means higher costs for electricity, higher costs for water supply. So we have been experiencing this, and this is all another key aspect that we have bringing this to the reality of Latin America are twofold. First is our cities are deeply unequal, and that has effects on the built environment and the green infrastructure. We have a large part of our population living in informal settlements. So this is a challenge because anytime we talk about infrastructure, usually we're talking about the legible or mapped infrastructure. And it's crucial that we also include those vulnerable settlements that usually are informal settlements precisely because they are in regions that are not apt for building or for construction. So it's steep mountains, it's close to the river banks, and that makes them even more exposed to these vulnerabilities. So this is something that now we see, for instance, in Medellin, they are creating a large project, they have been creating for over a decade, of green infrastructure in the low income communities. It's called social urbanism, the term, with urban farms and better housing, but also green infrastructure to protect from the urban heat effect, from the also landslides, because we know that when you have vegetation, the soil becomes stronger, so you have more water retention, and you're actually protecting the city in the middle of the valley, which is the, let's say, formal city, not the informal city. So this is also an insurance for the wealthier parts of the city. So it's a win-win situation in that case. And now we see another aspect, which is we are also in a pandemic, which meant a severe crisis for our cities. And we're seeing this in cities like São Paulo, Bogota, Rio, where there are now incentives for retrofitting or finding other uses for buildings in the downtown area. If we have a deficit of residential buildings and we have a huge building stock in central areas where you have usually nice parks, where you have access to the main transport system, where you have telecommunication infrastructure, why not use part of these buildings as residential buildings? And what some people, I was talking to the Secretary of Urban Planning last week of Rio, and he has this very clear understanding that according to Brazilian law, there's the social use of private property, but he's trying to say there's a social and ecological use of private property. Mm-hmm. So a building is not just a building in itself, it's part of a city. So you have to look at what is the impact of having that building occupied or built in a certain way on the surroundings and on the region. And we're helping them actually mapping the indicators and basically with a methodology to account for the carbon that is not being emitted for first, not building other buildings away from the city center, and second, also from people being able, what he calls even a 5-minute city. We've heard about the 15-minute city, but even the 5-minute city where people live close to basic urban services, to their job posts, to a hospital, to a park, 5 minutes away. This is a climate policy. Aside from being a social and economic and urban policy, it is a climate policy. So the effort right now, I think, is to really make sure that people understand how all of these things are intertwined and connected. So if you don't look at it from one of those angles, if you just look at climate without looking at social, you're not doing it right. And the other way around, if you're just looking at an economic policy without looking at the climate impacts, you won't get it right. And we don't have a lot of chances to make more mistakes.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective when you think about the investments that need to happen in infrastructure to both make it more climate, I guess climate neutral, if I can use that terminology, but also more resilient, right? How do you do that? Because I mean, it depends on the part of the world you're at. It can be anything from extreme heat to extreme weather events like flooding. So it can cover the range really depending on the region where you're located. And for me, the question comes, I think the discussion around this kind of interplay of hard kind of infrastructure investments and the social and environmental dimensions of that, I think is a really interesting discussion. Like, how does this integrate? How does it work together? But I think when we think about just obviously Canada, we have our own problems. We're very extreme weather here, from very cold in the winter to very hot in the summer. It's a vast country with significant, we get anything from tornadoes to flooding to ice storms, and it's really extreme climate up here at times. But I think what it comes really, when I think about just carbon and carbon emissions and infrastructure investment, I'm thinking just maybe the second part of our session today, thinking about how do we transition, like what you were talking about, Elon, but how do we transition now? How do we bring that in? Because one of the key things we need to do is we need to have energy systems and invest in energy infrastructure that's integrated and that is renewable. Because by 2050, we're supposed to be out of fossil fuels. And in the Americas, when you talk about both like formal cities, but then informal settlements, how is that supposed to work?
I'd like to start. Because you said one of my favorite words, which is integrated approaches. Yeah. And I think what Elon was really talking about is the important role of urban planning in advancing both climate mitigation and climate resilience. I think they're two sides of the same coin. And issues like location efficiency, transit-oriented design, compact growth, heat island mitigation, those really come as the result of using different approaches for urban planning. Rather than changing the tire on a moving vehicle, which most urban planning seems to be these days, I think it's important to take a step back and think about these problems in a new light. We've never had greater urgency to get it right. I love the 15-minute city idea. I love the idea of active transportation, which is a combination of public transportation and bikes and scooters and other types of means, and walking. That just fits in so well in nature-based solutions and green infrastructure. So I'd like to posit 4 things we need to do different that I think can address mega cities as well as informal rural settlements. And I think they're key trends that need to be incorporated. One is, the world seems to be going from outside in to inside out. The energy systems that we rely on were centralized, a few giant machines pumping out electrons through wires into cities where most people live. We now see an inside out strategy where we're building the grid of the future using distributed resources, whether that's solar PV or wind or storage. We're starting to think about rooftop solar and working out to community and district scale. That is a fundamental change in the way energy systems have evolved ever since Thomas and Edison and Tesla fought it out over AC and DC current. We need to think both smaller and bigger at the same time. Distributed energy resources lend themselves to application at a residential home level. There's nothing that says in rural developing countries we need to recreate landlines. That is the wrong metaphor. We don't need as many of those big plants. What we do need is energy access. We need reliability, and we need it to be clean. So building up from a school, building up from a housing development with local resources seems like an analogy to the cellular network that is built up in Central and Latin America. Maybe we can use that as a metaphor for the grid of the future. But we also need to think bigger. We have to stop thinking of buildings as individual entities and consider the districts and neighborhoods and communities that they're in. District energy systems are a perfect example of being able to leverage greater efficiency, but also leverage local resources such as data centers. In Europe, it's very common to take the waste heat from data centers, which is intense, and using heat pumps, provide additional heat sources to district heating and energy systems. We can do the same thing with our water infrastructure systems. Why isn't every water treatment plant capturing the methane, generating its own power? Water treatment plants, by definition, because no one wants to live near them, perfect sites for solar power and storage. That methane may actually be more valuable if there's an industrial plant nearby, because it can provide renewable gas for high temperature heating, which even in 2050 is going to be hard to deliver through heat pumps and solar and things such as that. Also, water systems have a lot of heat as the water leaves the buildings. We can use heat pump and electrification technology to boost that and provide renewable heating capabilities on a global basis. Those are just some examples there. Integration and distribution would be the last thing that I think we need to consider. Why doesn't a school have electric school buses? And why don't those electric school buses have EV chargers, which are connected to the utility, so that they can charge and discharge potentially based on the needs of the grid, and they can provide demand response when the grid peaks? And why don't the schools have solar power, which help charge the buses when they need charging? And why can't schools once again be considered emergency shelters during severe weather and grid outages? If we think about this instead of in the transportation silo, in the energy system silo, and in the building silo, we end up with healthy, resilient, net zero buildings and a greater contribution to the community. But we also have the opportunity, just take streetlights, you know? In a lot of cities, streetlights are owned by a utility, some are owned by the city, some are owned by a private party. They're the perfect place to put an EV charger because there's automatic right-of-ways along the roadside there. Why don't those light poles have EV charging? They already have power running to them. They're already on the distribution network, but they could do other things. They could have 5G communications mounted on the same pole. They could have PV to basically charge and recharge batteries for the EV charging. They could include sensors like air quality sensors. They could include security. There are so many things we could do if we could get every department, an agency or ministry in a government in the same room and did integrated planning where we could find the synergies. The synergies would come in cost reduction. They would also provide much, much greater impacts. It is hard to do, but it's definitely worth doing.
So Clay, before I go and ask Elon and his perspective, I couldn't agree more with you. I think this integrated planning is key, but we know that there are significant barriers in terms of just our siloed approach to everything we do. Sustainability is supposed to be integrated, but what we do as humans in our organizational and societal structures are very siloed around, you know, as you described. Just before I go into Elon, I just want to say, please send us your questions. We have about 10 minutes left, so we'd like to hear from you as well, for those on the call. Send us your questions for the panelists. So when you listen to that, Elon, this kind of integrated planning, I mean, you're like, when we talk about integrated planning, in my opinion, that has to happen at the city level, right? A lot of these things, it has to have the city level. The human population in the not so distant future, 80 to 90% of the human population will live in cities. Where do you see, Elon, maybe a good example? Where's the cutting edge on this in terms of integrated planning in the Americas?
Well, that's a tough question. I have to start perhaps by saying nobody's doing the homework, and that's not just in Latin America. I would say that's across the world. Again, the pandemic only made it worse because with cash-strapped governments, it's harder to bring in new policies or sometimes to bring innovation. Although an interesting factor that we found is that if you have a green and just recovery, and that means investing, for instance, in building efficiency, among other issues, you generate more jobs. But we're also missing that window of opportunity. A recent study has shown that less than 5% of the green and just recovery funds are actually green and just. So they're just for recovery of a business as usual. Having said that, we do have a lot of interesting cases in the region. So for instance, we have places like Mexico City. They have a very bold and clear policy on using recycled materials for new buildings. And this is a simple way to really decrease the what's called embedded carbon. So when usually talk about building efficiency, we're talking about the efficiency of the operation of the building. What energy we're using, what is the requirement for heat, and etc. However, there are some studies that show that by 2030, almost 75% of the carbon that is related to a building will be the embedded emissions from the construction part, which means all of the carbon needed to pump those materials out to actually get the concrete, the glass, the steel up, rather than the operation. So by using recycled materials, by making, for instance, this a requirement, which is what Mexico City and Santiago are looking at doing. So Rio already has a 20%, for instance, mandatory recycled concrete. You need those numbers to go further and to perhaps tax those buildings that use materials that are carbon intensive. Again, the main challenge now is an economic crisis where we know that the building sector is seen as a hope, and city governments want to have this sector literally and metaphorically heating to get the economy going. But we do have good examples also in Quito, for instance, where you build, and this is more of what Clay was saying, the kind of traditional way of looking at building efficiency, more focused on transport, because if you build close to a corridor, you get 50 or 100% more building rights. But allied to that, so that's the traditional part. That's we've been hearing since Curitiba started this. This is an innovation from Brazil, but back in the 70s and 80s. What they're also doing is they're creating, and this is true for Bogota, for, as I said, Quito, for Salvador, where you have tax incentives if you follow this menu of options for sustainability. So if you reach a specific amount of points, and that can be for a green roof, for solar energy, for better building envelope, for having green areas inside that lot, you also get benefits for building rights. So it's a new mixture of the traditional transport-focused planning with a more integrated planning, with water collection, rainwater collection, energy efficiency, green areas within and on the outskirts of the building. So we do see these examples, but we still need to move faster. And to me, just to, as in other places, this is now a political barrier. The technology is out there. We know what we have to do. And the simple answer will be this costs, the costs are higher. And that is not true, because the costs of doing things as we are doing is incredibly higher than taking the opportunities and the solutions that we know are right. The problem is making those externalities a part of the business case, because someone will have to pay for all of the costs of the inaction that we're having right now. Probably it's not us, but we have to build this into the equation, because there's no way that having sustainable buildings today is more expensive than business as usual if we look at our species history, not in our lifetime. So the challenge is the silo that you mentioned, but also how we can get these models to really reflect the benefits and the costs in a longer term.
Yeah, thank you, Ilan. I think we're getting close to time. We have about 5 minutes left for our session. So for me, and I think for many colleagues that I talk to, is that obviously the economic recovery post-COVID, infrastructure and the building sector is seen, as you pointed out, as a really important part of the recovery economy. Construction sector is always the first one to come in terms of employment and jobs. But I also see that there will be, not just in North America, but in Latin America and across the world, there will be, as we go into COVID recovery, will be massive investments in infrastructure and in building. That includes building, massive investments. And in terms of climate change, we have to get this right. Like, we have to get this right, because these infrastructure systems last 100 years, 200 years. In Europe, in Rome, they're still using the aqueducts that the Romans built for water supply. And part of that, even for the sewage as well. So very long-lasting investments. So maybe as closing thoughts from both of you, if you had, from your perspective, what should the infrastructure investments of tomorrow, or the infrastructure investments for a low-carbon economy, what should they look like? Maybe Clay, you go first, and then Ilan, you can take us to the finishing line. That'd be great.
Yeah, I'd like to just give another Latin American example. Santiago, Chile. They started investing in e-buses and as kind of a pilot. And what they found is that even though a e-bus has twice the purchase cost, it has a 70% lower operating and maintenance cost. And when they looked at the life cycle cost, they said, well, that's not really cost, that's an investment. We will more than recoup the investment over time. And they said, and oh, by the way, these new e-bus terminals that we're putting up, they're solar powered. They have LED lighting, which reduces our overall energy use as a city. They provide Wi-Fi to those waiting for the buses. There's USB charging. They provided a lot of services. The e-buses are air conditioned, which is not common in diesel powered buses. So the outcome is so much better. What we have to do is find a way to address the green premium. We have to find a way to either come up with business models like energy as a service, or mobility as a service, or zero carbon buildings as a service, so that you're getting the benefits, but you're paying for it through savings over time, similar to what Lee mentioned earlier. Blended finance. If we could focus public money on just the green premium, in green buildings, it's about 5 to 10%. If we could just focus public finance on that and educate private finance, we could easily talk ourselves into making buildings lower carbon and more resilient. And Ilan was exactly right. We need to find a way to monetize all these additional benefits. Air quality is a huge impact. The more fossil fuel we burn in buildings, the worse the indoor air quality and the outdoor air quality. Transportation, huge source of outdoor air quality issues. We need to find a way to incorporate those externalities into the business case. The United States made a small step. For the first time in the analysis of the cost effectiveness of our building codes, which are a key driver of greater efficiency, we looked at the carbon that would be reduced. It was always just about energy, and it was about paybacks. We started looking and quantified the carbon impacts, and they went further. They looked at the social cost of carbon, considering health and other factors. Now, that wasn't directly built into the cost effectiveness report, but we're starting to talk about what those additional benefits are. We need to talk more about carbon, we need to talk more about health, and we need to start incorporating this into when we make policies and regulations, because that's the true impact on our communities.
That's very, very well said, Clay. We are at time, but I want to give Ilan the last word. to talk about the value that green buildings and green infrastructure are creating rather than just the cost, because there's a value that goes, that's economic, that's environmental, and that's social, as you pointed out really well, Clay. So Ilan, last word to you before we close the session. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Thomas, Clay, and everyone who bear with us at this final session. It was a pleasure. Going back to your initial question, I think we have to look this as an infrastructure investment. And infrastructure is only useful if it can fulfill its goal. So if it's taking you somewhere, if it's a road, or if it's pumping your water of a flood, or if it brings you clean water. And if we look at buildings as also urban infrastructure, they will only be able to provide the objectives that they're built in the first place if they are now sustainable. And why we say this is all of the reasons we were talking about. Buildings as usual, as you said, they will be there for 80 years. If we don't look at how they deal with the heat, the drought, the flooding, the energy systems that are getting more expensive. So we need them to be decentralized units of energy generation. We need them to be highly efficient in water reuse. We need them to be also connected. Clay said, we're happy to support, we're still supporting Santiago in the electric bus transition. They need to transition the whole fleet. So these have to become connected to the grid, and they can actually give energy back to the grid at peak hours, and then of course charge the vehicles at night, for example, when there's no demand. So we have to look them as units in really a targeted and urgent strategy to tackle climate change. Every building can be either a hassle or an ally in this fight, and we cannot afford to have more hassles. We already built enough of those. Yeah, so I think that's my main message. And just finishing by saying that the best cities that we have are the ones that are already built. So we should think of solutions in the cities that we have. Latin America has a long history of urban dreams and urban nostalgia, where we brought architects and planners from around the world, especially in the 19th and 20th century, to dream of the ideal city. These cities never come true. The cities that we have are the ones that we have built environment, and finding solutions that are both environmental and socially equitable.
Yeah, thank you, Ilan. Thank you both, Clay and Ilan, for being panelists today. Thank you to World GBC for organizing the session. Juanita, who put a lot of work into organizing everything. So thank you, Juanita. Thank you all. It was a really great discussion, and we can obviously see that this could go on for quite some time. We haven't really scratched the surface. But with that, I hand it back to Juanita, who maybe has some closing words. Thank you all, and good to see you both.
Thank you very much, Thomas, Ilan, and Clay, for this outstanding session and for all of the information that you just shared with all of our network. And to close the first event of World Green Building Week, I would like to share that in a year of disruption, it would be easier to focus on the challenges. And as we have heard here in the session, building resilience doesn't happen in a silo or through a singular approach. That is why this World Green Building Week, we are shining a light on how our holistic approach to building resilience can accelerate the Sustainable Development Goals and sustainable buildings for everyone, everywhere. So to close the environmental, the social, and the economic gaps and protect our planet, people, and economies, we must embrace a holistic approach to sustainability. We must work towards systemic changes that provide powerful solutions to climate change, to improve human health and equity, and drive a circular regenerative economy. So join us from today until Friday to find out how our network is accelerating the Sustainable Development Goals towards an inclusive and resilient net zero built environment. You can go through our webpage, worldgbc.org, and see all of the activities that are happening across the world, across the globe, and join us, join our members and their initiatives. Look at the World GBC activity maps for World Green Building Week and join us in this transformation and in this conversation of building resilience for climate, people, and economies. Thank you very much to all of our moderators and panelists for the session today. And if you weren't able to participate throughout the whole session, we will be sharing the recording of the entire event. So thank you very much, and I wish you all a happy World Green Building Week. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody. Thank you for
Bye.
joining us.
Yeah, thank you.